Communication is not only spoken, but there is a special form used by the deaf people, the gesture language. These languages are also different, and they also meet problems in intercultural communication. This will be the topic of Professor Reagan. Professor Reagan, Timothy Reagan, is a professor at Maine University, currently the Dean of the College of Education and Human Development. He has had administrative positions in several universities. His research areas include many topics, but we could tell that language planning and policy, foreign language teaching, educational politics, and also deaf studies. He has published many papers and dozen books. His speech deals with the relation of sign languages and intercultural communication. Please.
Good morning, everyone. What I am going to be talking about today are issues related to sign languages, deafness and deaf people, and how these relate to issues of the human rights, the fundamental linguistic human rights of deaf people. And I want to begin by congratulating and thanking the conference organizers, because I speak at a lot of linguistics conferences. And for those of us who are interested in issues of sign language, one of the frustrations is that usually at most there are only one or two papers that deal with sign language, and they're usually sort of marginalized. If you look at your program for this conference, we have a whole, in addition to my talk, we have a whole section dealing with sign language. And this is a really important and a huge and a significant improvement. We also have a speaker who is herself deaf, and that is also incredibly important. Let me begin with what seems like an odd question, which is, what does it mean when we say someone is deaf? That's a question that for hearing people usually sounds like it's almost insane. Well, being deaf means you cannot hear. There's hearing loss. But that's a normative definition. It focuses on a particular physiological aspect of a human being. And there are other ways to conceptualize deafness. When we focus on hearing and hearing loss, we're essentially locking ourselves into a disability framework. But we can also think about deafness in terms of a difference framework. And if we do that, if we think about deaf people not as a disabled or handicapped group, but instead as a cultural and linguistic group, we're forced to reconsider a lot of our very fundamental and basic assumptions. This was put very nicely in a book called A Journey into the Deaf World, when the authors argued when hearing people think about deaf people, they project their concerns and subtractive perspective onto deaf people. The result is an inevitable collision with the values of the deaf world, whose goal is to promote the unique heritage of deaf language and culture. The disparity in decision-making power between the hearing world and the deaf world renders this collision frightening for deaf people. Now, when we look across human history, as far back as we know, deaf people have in fact been using sign language. But for most of human history, those sign languages that deaf people have used have not been recognized as real languages. They've certainly been understood to be communication. but in virtually every society, they have been looked down on. They have been seen as being fundamentally inferior to spoken language, and until quite recently, in any standard linguistics textbook, we would teach students that one of the basic characteristics of any human language is that it used an oral modality. That is, that it was spoken. So in deciding whether something is a language or not, the first question is, well, is it spoken? Do people listen to it? That changed in 1960. And it changed with the work of a man named William Stokoe. Stokoe was a young assistant professor at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. Gallaudet University, as you probably know, is a university for deaf students where the dominant means of instruction is American Sign Language. When Stokoe arrived at Gallaudet, everyone, deaf and hearing, assured him that sign language was very useful, but it wasn't real language. Everybody knew that. Stokoe watched what was happening around him. He watched his students communicate, and he watched his colleagues communicate. And because he didn't come from a background in deaf education, he was able to see what other people had not seen. And he published this very short monograph in 1960, Sign Language Structure, where he basically said, you know what, I've been paying attention. This is a real language. That changed the world. In terms of sign language linguistics, Bill Stokoe is as important as Noam Chomsky is for linguistics more generally. Before William Stokoe, we didn't deal with sign language as real language, and afterwards, it was no longer credible to say that sign language wasn't real language. And I want to begin by just going through some common myths about sign language and some common truths about sign language, things that are simply unarguably the case. First of all, we now know that sign languages are full and complete human languages. Now, let me say, I'm going to talk in a moment about signing and sign language. Not all signing is sign language, but sign languages like American Sign Language, British Sign Language, Russian Sign Language, and so on are full and complete languages that meet all of the needs of their speakers. And from that, you can already determine that there are a whole bunch of different, distinct sign languages. In fact, we know of more than 200, and there are probably a lot more that we don't know about. Third, sign languages are not simply a way of coding spoken languages. They are different languages that do not overlap and are not related. So in the case of American Sign Language is in no way English, nor is British Sign Language. And in fact, British Sign Language and American Sign Language aren't related either. Sign languages have full and complete phonological, morphological, and syntactic structures. They have to, because they are indeed full and complete languages. And finally, anything you can convey in a spoken language can be conveyed in a sign language. Gallaudet provides the perfect example of that. Gallaudet currently has a number of doctoral programs that are taught in American Sign Language. I would suggest to you that if you can offer a doctorate in a particular language, you are probably able to do pretty much anything else. Now, this chart shows you the point I made earlier, which is that not all signing is sign language. In the American case, for example, there is a continuum from ASL on one end to English on the other. These are different languages, and so we move from ASL into a whole host of different kinds of contact sign languages, which used to be called pidgins, but we now call them contact sign, into manually coded ways of presenting English. And there are a number of these. Signing exact English is the most common, but there's also signed English, linguistics of visual English or LOVE, and so on. These are ways, these are systems, artificially created systems for representing English in a visual and gestural way. They're a modality of English, in the same way writing is a modality of English. So when you're dealing with a manual sign code, you are indeed not dealing with a sign language. You are dealing with a way of representing a spoken language. Now, those manual sign codes have been somewhat controversial. And Carol Payton and Tom Humphreys, two deaf authors, have argued this very nicely. They say, however well-intentioned, the persuasive belief that sign languages are essentially incomplete systems amenable to modification for educational purposes. They ignore the fact that individual signs, like words, are inseparable parts of a larger grammatical system. In other words, what the manual sign codes do is they take pieces, bits and pieces from a sign language, and they use them in what is really a spoken language. So they're not languages on their own. Now, my focus here today is on only one type of signing. Specifically, the kinds of signing, the kinds of signed languages that are used by deaf people most often as their vernacular language in communicating with other deaf people. Now, some of my colleagues here in a few moments are going to be talking about international sign, the kinds of signing that take place when deaf people from different sign language backgrounds who use normally different sign languages are placed in situations where they need to communicate. International sign is very important, but for the most part, most sign language linguists would argue it isn't a full and complete sign language in the way that a language like British Sign Language, American Sign Language, French Sign Language, and so on would be. So, sign languages aren't universal. There is no single universal international sign language that all deaf people know or use. So we do have international sign, but it's not something that deaf people naturally know. It's a particular kind of signing. There are lots of different sign languages that we know a great deal about. These are books just on this page here, British Sign Language, Argentine Sign Language, Australian Sign Language, New Zealand Sign Language, Russian Sign Language, French Sign Language, German Sign Language, Danish Sign Language. And again, there are hundreds of distinct sign languages. They share certain elements in the same way spoken languages share certain elements, but they differ in important ways as well. Sign languages are acquired by deaf children normally in ways that are very similar to the ways hearing children acquire spoken languages. Furthermore, sign languages are related to other languages, but they're related to other sign languages. So there are sign language families in the same way we talk about the Romance language family or the Slavic language family. This chart shows you primarily two of the major sign language families. The French Sign Language family, which American Sign Language is part of, the Austrian Sign Language family, but there's also the British Sign Language family. Now, sign languages have full and complete phonological, morphological, and syntactic structures. And I've got a list of some of the key elements of those structures. And I'm not going to go through them because we would be here for the rest of the day. But what this points out is that there really is a full and complete grammar in a natural sign language. There's also, of course, resistance to believing what I just said. There are still huge numbers of people who don't really believe that sign language is a real language. And what that means is there is linguistic imperialism and linguicism. The picture I have up there right now for you is an example of a situation that was deeply, deeply offensive to deaf people around the world. This is a picture of President Barack Obama speaking at the funeral of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And you can see next to Mandela, there's a man standing there. And that man was apparently his sign language interpreter, who was supposed to be interpreting Obama's words into South African Sign Language. The only problem with that is that the man standing next to President Obama doesn't know any South African Sign Language, nor did he know any other sign language. In fact, he was a man who had been recently released, who had been diagnosed with certain mental problems. Ask yourself, if the President of the United States were in your own country and needed an interpreter, would it be possible? Could you imagine that interpreter being a phony? And I would suggest to you that in virtually every other context, this is unthinkable. But it happened. These are quotes from various lawsuits. And again, I want to stress, I didn't make these up. These are real. So in the purple, according to Mr. Ali, a deaf plaintiff, the judge yelled at him to decide whether he was guilty or not and signed the paper and screamed at him loudly, stating, "That's a lie. You can hear me." Just as speaking more loudly does not help a person understand a spoken language better if they don't speak it, it certainly doesn't help a deaf person. The second is from the United States. That was from India. The second is from the United States and from the state of Oklahoma. The district attorney said the fact that Sanchez was deaf was irrelevant. You don't need to hear to know what these officers are saying to you. That's one of those things where you your jaw drops and you say, "Excuse me? Did someone really say that?" And the answer is yes. This is part of the linguicism that deaf people deal with all the time. Nor is it new, of course. Robert McGregor in 1896, and Robert McGregor was the first president of the National Association of the Deaf in the United States, said, "The utmost extreme to which tyranny can go is when its mailed hand descends upon a conquered people. Is the prescription of their national language, what heinous crime have the deaf been guilty of that their language should be prescribed?" Now, just as there is sign language, with every other language, there's a concomitant culture, whether it's French and French culture, Spanish and Spanish culture, or Mexican culture, or whatever, Esperanto and the Esperanto movement and culture. Language and culture goes together. The same is true with sign language. Sign languages fit together with what is commonly called the deaf world, which is the way we sign the idea. There are two ways, fundamentally, of thinking about deafness. One is based in disability theory, and one is based in anthropology. Here you see two symbols. There's a lady who says, "You're deaf. That's a shame." And you can imagine the pity in that. The other is the sign for deaf pride. The idea that, yes, I'm deaf and there's nothing wrong with being deaf. I'm proud of being deaf. Now, I know that that strikes many hearing people as an odd thing to hear, but in fact, it is the way many, many deaf people see the world. And we write this differently. What you see here is a nice painting that distinguishes between a lowercase d in deaf and an uppercase D in deaf. Capital D, deaf, means culturally deaf. It means you use ASL or some other natural sign language and you identify with the deaf cultural community. Lower D, deaf, means you're audiologically deaf. So, there are many older people, a group I am rapidly joining, who are losing their hearing, who are suffering from measurable amounts of hearing loss. They are hearing people who are losing the ability to hear. But their world is the hearing world, and their language is the spoken language. They are lowercase d and will never be uppercase d. Now, the deaf culture that I'm talking about here, this deaf world, includes a number of features. It includes language, specifically a natural sign language. It includes a literary and artistic tradition. So, for example, many sign languages have incredibly rich oral traditions as well as wonderful poetry. There's cultural identity and identification. Identifying with other deaf people as your primary affiliation. Endogamous marital patterns, marrying in group. In my experience in the United States, deaf people are very comfortable marrying across racial lines, for example, or across religious lines, far more so than most people. Marrying across the hearing boundary, though, is somewhat rarer. It's more difficult. There are specific behavioral norms associated with deafness. Now, some of these are simply logical. When a person is in the process of learning American Sign Language, one of the things students will often say is, I'm uncomfortable when I'm using ASL because people are staring at me. Well, yes, because if we're going to communicate, we have to watch. You can't do what we do in a spoken language, which is look away. If you look away, you've indicated I'm not paying attention to you. There are attitudes and values associated with the deaf world. There are cultural artifacts. The most common cultural artifact in the world right now, you see on that t-shirt, which is the short form for I love you. And you get pieces of jewelry and bumper stickers and things like that. I would add, as just a personal note, we also teach a lot of very young children to do this. And I've been in kindergartens with hearing children where all of the kids are doing this with the I love you sign. There's a little problem with that, I would note, because if you turn it like this, the sign is an airplane. And so if you see kids going like this, you're talking about an airplane that is in very serious trouble. There is historical knowledge and historical mythology. There is culturally specific humor. There are jokes about deafness and jokes about hearingness. Jokes about situations that deaf people find frustrating, but a lot more jokes about situations where, if you will, deaf people, hearing people just don't get it. And finally, there are in-group social organizations. So, for example, in the United States, the National Association of the Deaf. And let me just mention there, that's an important name. The National Association of the Deaf, which is an organization created by, run by deaf people. In the 1980s in South Africa, there was a comparable organization called the South African Foundation for the Deaf. The difference between of and for here is huge. Of is an in-group organization. For is a case of an organization where hearing people are doing their best to help deaf people they feel sorry for. Again, a world of difference. This just gives you a sense of some of the cultural differences between the hearing world and the deaf world. Some of these things are simply pragmatic, but some of them are much deeper than that. These are all visual representations of this idea of the deaf world or deaf culture, deaf identity. And I especially like the quote from Jesse Jackson. The problem is not the deaf students do not hear. The problem is that the hearing world does not listen. Now, when we talk about sign language and the world of the deaf, there are some fundamental differences between both the way the languages operate and the way the culture operates. One good way to see this is in the expression hard of hearing. In American Sign Language, if I sign someone is a little bit hard of hearing, what it means is that they have very little residual hearing. I think I got that wrong. I'm sorry. Let me say that again. If we describe someone as very hard of hearing, it means that they have a lot of residual hearing. The idea is that what is normative, what is seen as normal, is different in ASL than it is in English. In fact, it's just flipped around. In fact, the whole language that we have to describe hearing and deafness is different. In English, we can talk about someone being hearing, someone being deaf, or someone being hard of hearing. In ASL, though, we have a number of other terms. Certainly, we can describe someone as being hearing, and we can describe someone as being deaf. But we can also use the word heathy. That's not a real English word, but it's signed like this. And what it means is a person who is audiologically deaf, but thinks like a hearing person. And then there is the sign hearing but, which is used to describe a person who is a hearing person, but who does understand deaf people and presumably who can use ASL. Now, I want to say that this distinction between the medical or pathological view of deafness and this second sociocultural model of deafness is useful. It's heuristically useful. But it's not complete. It's not terribly accurate, and it never has been. We started using it in the 1960s. And again, it was valuable. But in fact, the deaf world is a lot more complex than it suggests. Furthermore, one of the things that underlies the tensions that deaf people face is the challenge of what is called audism. Now, audism is the same kind of ideology that racism and sexism are, except that it focuses on assumptions about hearing and the inability to hear. So very often, one of the greatest challenges faced by deaf people is oppression based on assumptions hearing people have about what the deaf can and cannot do. There are things that a deaf person cannot do, but there are very, very few things. And the question has to be, is this something that we are making assumptions about, or is this a real barrier? As with racism and sexism, of course, audism isn't something that happens only with hearing people. There are deaf people who are also audist. There are deaf people who are anti-deaf. And that's often tied to assumptions about spoken language. Now, I also want to distinguish here between audism, which is ideological and profoundly dangerous, and just plain stupidity. Waitress, did you really just ask your deaf customer if they wanted a menu in Braille? Now, this is a poster that's readily available, but I've actually heard people say, oh, well, you need that in Braille, talking to deaf people. They're confusing deafness and blindness. These are not comparable conditions. Now, one of the things that it's very important to keep in mind as we talk about the challenges that the deaf face is that deaf people are a marginalized community in every society that they live in. They are a linguistic minority, and they have fewer rights than almost any other linguistic minority. But there's an important difference, which is that their language barrier is not only that of being a linguistic minority, but that there is a physiological barrier. Now, I'm going to stop here for just a moment because I do have a question, which is it possible to construct an international sign language based on Esperanto? And the answer to that is yes. And in fact, when people later on are going to be talking about international sign, there is something called signed Esperanto. So the answer is yes, but there are very, very, very few deaf people who have learned Esperanto. International sign in general is a better response. I'm actually getting more questions. I'm going to go ahead with the questions and then hope to finish, if that's all right with everyone. Does Deaf Nation address a global nation? Actually, we use the term in two different ways. We talk about deaf world in any particular country. So there's an American deaf world, but there's also a global deaf world that shares many characteristics, but is also in different countries somewhat distinct. And I should also say that just as there are national sign languages that I've been talking about, so too within countries are there smaller sign languages. So there are village sign languages, community sign languages, and so on. Now, when I was talking about the special physiological barriers, this is important, especially in the context of education. This is a wonderful quote. It's getting old now, but from Danielle Bouvet, who argued, while true bilingualism is linguistically harmless for ordinary children, it is linguistically necessary for deaf children. Only through bilingualism can deaf children acquire speech naturally. And that's the point. Now, I would go further and say bilingualism isn't just harmless, it's good for everybody, but it's absolutely necessary for deaf people. And that brings me to the last point I want to talk about, which is the whole issue of language rights and the deaf. There are about 50 countries in the world that have granted their national sign language, at least, with some sort of official status. The case of New Zealand is one of the most recent and powerful. In New Zealand, New Zealand Sign Language, English, and Maori are all official languages. Now, this looks good. But let me say that, first of all, from country to country, what it means to be an official sign language varies. And in some cases, it means we've added a line to the Constitution, but we haven't changed behavior. In other cases, it means that we've made some changes in terms of education or interpreting rights. In almost no case does it give deaf people the same rights that hearing people have. And that's the real issue. Deaf people have the same fundamental linguistic human rights that anyone else has. But they have been denied those human rights over and over and over again. And I'm going to end now because we really are out of time. And I will be happy to answer any questions. I'm looking at my column here. Have I missed anything? Are there any? Oh, okay. Okay, first of all, again, we're going to have some speakers talking about international sign as well as sign Esperanto. Let me just say, in terms of that piece of the question, international sign is not a fully developed sign language. It's what we call the sign language that exists when deaf people from different language backgrounds have to communicate. So there are some common syntactic features, but it isn't a full language. And the reason it works, by the way, and it does work reasonably well, is that most deaf people spend most of their lives interacting with hearing people who don't sign. So they're very good at communicating with people with whom they don't share a complete language. Now, if you have two people like that trying to communicate and interact, they're going to communicate better than two hearing people who don't share a language. As for sign Esperanto, that's more complicated. And again, I think somebody's going to be answering that.
I see yet one more questions which could be interesting for everybody. Can you see it?
I'm not sure.
Uh-huh.
I'm having trouble. Can you read it to me?
Yes. Does deaf nation address a global nation? It means the role of national boundaries is downplayed in this conceptualization.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought I answered that, but the answer is sort of yes and no. Sometimes we talk about the deaf world in a particular national context. So in the United States, the deaf world really refers to deaf people in the United States and Canada. But there's a broader deaf world, which is the international community of deaf people who share what we call the deaf experience. So even though there are differences from country to country and even from region to region, there are also incredible commonalities. All deaf people face autism. All deaf people have educational challenges. In almost every country, the educational system is dominated by hearing people, and so on. So, yes, there are national deaf worlds and deaf cultures, but there's also this bigger, more common deaf world and deaf culture. Does that answer the question?
I think so, and thank you very much for this introduction to the inward world, because most of us are not familiar with this aspect of communication, and even that there is an international side of it. And those interested in the communication of the deaf people are welcome to the next session, which is dedicated for this problematics. So thank you very much.